Hey everyone, and welcome back to the channel. Today, we're diving into a really dark chapter of American history, one that's often glossed over when we talk about the Roaring Twenties. We all know about Prohibition, the noble experiment to ban alcohol. We picture flappers, speakeasies, and gangsters like Al Capone. But behind this romanticized image lies a horrifying truth. A story of how a government policy led directly to the deaths of thousands of its own citizens. This isn't just about the dangers of illegal booze. It's about a deliberate act of poisoning. So, let's set the scene. It's 1920, and the 18th Amendment has just gone into effect. The production, sale, and transport of intoxicating liquors are now illegal. The goal was to reduce crime and improve public health. But as we know, it didn't quite work out that way. Instead of stopping people from drinking, it just drove the industry underground. Speakeasies popped up everywhere, and a massive black market for alcohol exploded. The demand was huge, and criminals were more than happy to supply it. But where were they getting all this alcohol? A lot of it came from a surprising source: industrial alcohol. Now, industrial alcohol is basically pure ethanol, the same stuff that's in your beer or whiskey. But it's used for all sorts of industrial purposes, like in fuels, solvents, and chemical manufacturing. Because it wasn't meant for drinking, it was exempt from the heavy taxes placed on beverages. To make sure no one drank it, the government had a long-standing policy of denaturing it. This meant adding toxic chemicals to make it undrinkable. Before Prohibition, this was a pretty standard practice. The chemicals used were things like methanol, also known as wood alcohol, which had a distinct smell and taste that would warn anyone off. But once Prohibition started, everything changed. Bootleggers, being the resourceful entrepreneurs they were, figured out that they could hire chemists to renature this industrial alcohol. They could remove the denaturing agents, making the ethanol drinkable again. They'd then water it down, maybe add some flavorings, and sell it as gin or whiskey in speakeasies across the country. For a while, it was a cat-and-mouse game. The government would add a new chemical, and the bootleggers' chemists would figure out how to remove it. This is where the story takes a truly sinister turn. By the mid-1920s, government officials were getting frustrated. Prohibition wasn't working. People were drinking more than ever, and organized crime was flourishing. In their desperation to enforce the law, they decided to escalate their chemical warfare. They weren't just trying to make the alcohol taste bad anymore. They were trying to make it deadly. In 1926, the government, under the Coolidge administration, made a fateful decision. They ordered companies to use much stronger poisons to denature industrial alcohol. They doubled the amount of methanol required and added other highly toxic substances like kerosene, chloroform, and acetone. The head of the Prohibition Bureau at the time essentially said that if people insisted on breaking the law by drinking this stuff, it was their own fault if they got sick or died. The message was clear: drink illegal booze and you're gambling with your life. The public health officials of the day were horrified. Charles Norris, the chief medical examiner for New York City, was one of the most vocal critics. He saw firsthand the devastating effects of this policy. People were pouring into city hospitals, suffering from horrific symptoms. Methanol is a brutal poison. It attacks the central nervous system and the optic nerve. Victims would experience severe abdominal pain, followed by blindness, paralysis, and all too often, a painful death. Norris and his chief toxicologist, Alexander Gettler, began a public crusade to expose what was happening. They conducted autopsies and chemical analyses, proving that the victims were being killed by the government's own denaturing formulas. They called it our national experiment in extermination. Think about that. The government was knowingly poisoning a product that they knew people were drinking. The scale of the tragedy was staggering. On New Year's Day in 1927 alone, over 40 people died in New York City from poisoned alcohol. By the end of Prohibition in 1933, it's estimated that at least 10,000 Americans, and possibly many more, were killed by this government-sanctioned poison. Tens of thousands more were left permanently blind or paralyzed. These weren't gangsters or hardened criminals. They were ordinary people. Factory workers, clerks, everyday folks who just wanted a drink after a long day. They weren't rich enough to afford the high-quality smuggled liquor from Canada or Europe, so they relied on the cheap, dangerous stuff sold in local speakeasies. They were the ones who paid the ultimate price for the government's failed experiment. Public outrage grew, but the government refused to back down. They argued that they were not responsible for the choices of lawbreakers. The head of the Prohibition Bureau, James Doran, famously declared, "The government is under no obligation to furnish the people with alcohol that is drinkable when the Constitution prohibits it." It was a cold, bureaucratic response to a massive public health crisis that they themselves had created. This policy became a major talking point for the anti-prohibition movement. They argued that a law intended to save people was now actively killing them. How could the government justify a policy that led to such widespread death and suffering? When Franklin D. Roosevelt ran for president in 1932, repealing prohibition was a cornerstone of his campaign. The economic devastation of the Great Depression was a major factor, of course, but the moral bankruptcy of the poisoning policy played a huge role in turning public opinion against the 18th Amendment. People were tired of the violence, the corruption, and the senseless deaths. They realized that the noble experiment had become a deadly failure. In December 1933, the 21st Amendment was ratified, and prohibition was finally over. The flow of poisoned alcohol stopped almost overnight, but the legacy of this dark period remains. It's a chilling reminder of the law of unintended consequences and how a government, in its zeal to enforce a moral crusade, can end up committing horrifying acts against its own people. It's a part of the prohibition story that is often left out of the history books, overshadowed by the more glamorous tales of gangsters and G-men. But the thousands of victims of this government poisoning program deserve to be remembered. Their story is a stark warning about the dangers of extreme policies and the human cost of legislative zeal. It shows what can happen when the government decides that the lives of some of its citizens are expendable in the pursuit of a flawed ideal. So next time you hear about the Roaring Twenties and the era of Prohibition, remember the full story. Remember the speakeasies and the flappers, but also remember Charles Norris, Alexander Gettler, and the thousands of nameless victims who died not just from breaking the law, but from a poison deliberately put in their path by their own government.